Morning. So, continuing on possibilities, uh, trying to step away a little bit from talking too much about the issues and get a more solution centered approach, which I believe is important. Uh, so, possibilities. I alluded at the end of the last video about the possibilities of in mental health. Uh, now, I'm making these videos specifically uh, to deal with issues of childhood trauma uh, and suicide and crime and such like. And my broad argument is that the practices of modern mental health is not meeting the needs of First Nations people, Alaska Native people, and American Indians. I would argue it probably doesn't meet the needs of a majority of uh, people, and especially if you're a minority, because so few of these practices are developed with minority input. There's reasons for that. Mental health is a very profitable uh, career. Uh, Paying $150 an hour for services is a large economic driver. Furthermore, having to have a master's or doctorates to be a practitioner is a large hurdle to get past. And having national best practices, which requires extensive funding and time and effort, longevity put it through, and a lot of support from nonprofit funders, really does not lend itself to developing minority programming, primarily because, well, most new programs, new uh, methodologies, new theories, new practices, they require a lot of support to develop. Uh, if it's not a national best practices, it has to be done either through volunteer or through a specific grant. And if you look at housing and law enforcement and justice and every statistic across the board, minorities are underrepresented when there's benefits and overrepresented in issues that are not beneficial. For example, domestic violence is in addiction and crime and everything across the board. Minorities are struggling a lot more with that, and it's not because only because minorities are creating more issues. It's also because minorities are targeted and also held to a higher level than non-minorities. And that is could be argued, but it's kind of like arguing whether the sun is warm or not, or whether the sunshine is falling on a blade of grass. Yes, the sun shines all over the place, but it's also falling on that one blade of grass as well. And uh, that's to say that this issue exists and it has always existed. So, with this struggle to create new programs that target our specific issues, we are really stuck applying uh, a cure that's not for our specific illness. Uh, First Nations people, we have a different belief system than our Western counterparts. We have a different outlook on the world. That's a part of our culture. We're a people. We recognize ourselves as a people. We recognize one First Nations person as being a part of our people. And, and that means that we think more collectively. And I think our practices have to take into account these things uh, and work with our individual people our Native, our First Nations people to create a First Nations society. And that's to say, I am Alaska Native and I have issues related to child abuse. And those issues are not just personal issues. I don't have a personal issue because I was traumatized as a child. Yes, on one hand, they are personal issues. That's to say, my response to it determines how I learn from that. But we also need to see that our issues are family issues, they're cultural issues. And that doesn't mean that our families are creating the issues, or it doesn't mean that our families are worse than other families. I believe all mental health is a family related issue across the board. But I believe specifically that childhood trauma issues are family issues because the trauma happened in a family due to a family. As to say, as a child, if I was traumatized, especially if I'm First Nations, I was traumatized by people who are close to me. And those people will remain close to me until I die. They are a part of my identity. And if I am raised and traumatized, and the people that love me does not deal with the trauma, and I cannot verbalize what happened, then I'm being forced to deal with something that a family and a community did, as of I'm the only one involved in it. And that's an impossibility. We can't deal with grieving for a lost childhood when we can't acknowledge that our childhood was lost. Because to acknowledge our childhood was lost is to acknowledge why it was lost and how it was lost. And not being able to share ourselves, not being able to share our true experience of life, our true experience as human beings, we are indeed isolated. That's the definition of being isolated. Not being alone because my cousin could stand next to me, my mother could stand next to me, my abuser and my mother could stand next to me. And I cannot share to my mother that I've been abused, and I cannot share to my abuser that he hurt me. And I cannot tell anybody that I've been hurt or that I'm remembering what happened. When the memory comes up, I have to put it away somehow. I have to contain it within myself and not let it out. Because if I let it out, people will ask me, what is that you're doing? When a person is raised in an alcoholic home, they are taught how to be addicted. Because addiction is not just a choice, it's a set of traits a person has. A person practicing addiction practices certain behaviors that teach other people. We, if we raise a child in a home that practices addiction, in that addiction is required for that addiction to continue, that the belief system on the part of the practitioner and all who enable them is that they cannot stop. I drink coffee, and I drink coffee And if coffee is destroying my life and I keep drinking it, what would I say? I can't get up in the morning without coffee. I can't go through a day without coffee. I smoke cigarettes. Why do I smoke cigarettes when I know it's going to destroy my health and that it's actively damaging me? Because I say, I can't quit. And that statement is actually a lie. And we lie to ourselves. I have to lie to myself when I say I can't quit smoking, I can't quit drinking coffee, I can't do this is a lie we tell ourselves to prevent change and to prevent accountability. And when we raise kids in a family, in an environment where I can't quit drinking, I can't quit smoking, I can't quit beating people, I can't quit, I can't change, is our excuse, our reason for ongoing traumatic events to a kid. When we do that, we implant in that person things. One, we normalize addiction. We normalize it in saying that people cannot quit even if they want to. And that's normalizing addiction. And we excuse addictive behaviors, abusive behaviors, by saying a person is addicted and they can't change. So we normalize addiction and we normalize or we minimize, we excuse, we condone the behaviors of addicted individuals because it's a disease. And that is a fairly true view of it. That's to say that when I see an alcoholic or a drug addict, I recognize that person as someone who is struggling to meet their needs in this world by any means possible. And that involves addictive behaviors, addictive use of substances and drugs, or just substances, period, or cyclical behavior, cheating, violence, theft, lying, threatening to take kids, other ways of controlling people. Mm. And these traits are taught to our kids. It's lived by them. And oftentimes we think that we could raise a kid or find a person who has been addictively raised and take them at 16, 17, 14, 13 and tell them, don't do what your parents did. Don't do what your brothers are doing. Don't do what your mom and dad are doing. Don't do what your uncles and aunties are doing. And don't do what whoever else is doing. Be different and be stronger. Go to counseling and such like. And that's good advice if we are not going to confront traumatic behavior, behaviors that introduce trauma and wrong teachings to our people. If we aren't going to stop as a people and turn around and face these issues as what they are, traumatic events that we need to stop, just like if we are inadvertently feeding our kids poison for whatever reason, be it the only food we have is poison, the only thing we have to give them is poison. If we're doing that and we want to have healthy children, we need to stop poisoning them. And if we can't stop for whatever reason, that's our only food, we don't know how to make other food, there's no other way to feed them, then we need to start dealing with them as of they are poison people. We cannot feed children poison or feed ourselves poison, eat rat poison, and go to the hospital and get treated for pneumonia. We don't have pneumonia, we have a rat poison problem. And I think mental health falls short in that area, that we are trying to treat family issues as personal issues. We're trying to treat the issue of addictive upbringings by telling people that it's a personal problem, and it's not. And it's not just dangerous for the individual, because if, like me, being raised with a great amount of childhood trauma, treating my childhood trauma as a personal problem sets me up for a lot of failures, and it sets people up for failures. A traumatized person is going to be living with a family that traumatized them. And if there's no discussion about it, that trauma is going to remain. And to teach that individual how to coexist, to live happily and at peace with people who are abusive to them, is not good advice. Terrible advice. I think that I know in a lot of ways our counseling is teaching abuse victims to stay in abusive situations around abusive people. And how do we overcome that? What do we say to someone in our culture today uh, who have been traumatized and is now living, let's say, with depression and relational problems? They're struggling to relate to their baby's mom or dad. They're depressed, and they're using alcohol to deal with it, and they're starting to feel slightly suicidal. So they call up and say, I need counseling. And what can we do as a people to meet their needs? What should we be teaching them? What should we be trying to instill in them? I think that ultimately the truth of things will always come out, and people who could learn the truth will have to adapt to it. And this is a difficult point for most people who enter counseling, most people who come from a family that abused them, or come from a family that traumatized them, knowingly or otherwise. Being raised in an addictive home is to be raised by parents who are busy practicing their addiction and dealing with the outcomes of their addiction, the shame, the physical fallout, imprisonment, arrest, lack of money, living in cheap places, getting beat up, having health problems. They're dealing with those. And their kids are pretty much struggling to meet their own needs as well. And that's normal in an addictive home. And it happens regularly. And this childhood teaches traits that lends itself to addictive behaviors and addictive lifestyles. For example, being raised in a home that lives in deceit, that functions on deceit. And deceit is what it is when an addictive parent lies regularly and says, I'm a good person, I love you, I care about you, I'll die for you, but I won't quit drinking for you. And when I'm drinking or when I'm drugging or when I'm practicing my addictive behaviors, I'm hurting you. And being forced to not share your feelings and your thoughts and your true experiences from childhood on teaches you to live a life where you hide your true feelings and your true thoughts. You are taught that. And sharing your true feelings has always been met with negative outcomes. It has always been a negative thing. And a person who grows up in that life associates the truth, sharing true negative feelings, sharing feelings of loneliness, isolation, fear, anger, grief, disappointment. Sharing any of those feelings is met with negativity and is met with pushback. And what that means is that a person associates open sharing of feelings with negative outcomes. Thus, sharing negative feelings, sharing your feelings, especially the ones negative associated with other people hurting you and your family, are seen as attacking other people. It is seen as hurting people that love you. It's seen as unloving behavior. And that is a fact. That is an outcome of living in a family with addictive cyclical behavior. And it doesn't matter which behavior or which addiction you choose. And we have to recognize that that's what's happening to our people, that we are being taught and we are being made to walk in deceit. And to get out of it, to speak about it, is the way out. And that's an approved of and understood fact, truth, accepted by modern day counseling, that you go to counseling so you could verbalize your feelings and your thoughts and your beliefs. And through verbalizing them and looking at them and exploring them, you will understand them better. And you may even come to understand the people who are abusing you better. And you will. And it's through speaking and talking to your counselor that you could reach a point of self awareness and forgiveness for yourself and for others. And it's through forgiving your perpetrators, forgiving yourself for not being able to stop the abuse, and forgiving your abuser for failing to control themselves and prevent the abuse. And when you work on this forgiveness, you begin to see your abusers in a different light. You begin to see their humanity. You begin to see that they were good people who made terrible mistakes. That's the hope of counseling. And through forgiveness and acceptance, you develop grace and understanding and wisdom. Because if you can't punish your enemies, You're going to hate them until you understand why they did it. You're going to accept it, or you're going to keep hating them. We go to counseling to stop our hate. Hate feels like anger, but it also feels like deep, endless, unmet needs. You wake up in the morning and there's something you have to do. There's something that you have to get somebody to do for things to be right. And you try all day. You're angry at them. You ain't going to be right until they change, until you change the situation. Now we reach a point of forgiveness of our abusers, and in many cases, that's of our entire family. And in my case, and in many cases, that's of my people who refused to do anything when they knew what was happening. So when you reach this point of forgiveness, what do you understand? And what's the two directions you could go in when you reach a point of forgiveness for your abusers and understanding of them and grace? Well, if I'm living in my community and I've been traumatized there, let's say something simple. Uh, I was repeatedly beaten up by people who drink all the time and they're running around practicing violence against people. And I grow up in that, and everybody allows it to happen, and nobody stops it. And now, as a man, I'm walking around a community, and I look around and say, I'm not at peace because this man who beat me is beating someone else, and I can't do anything about it. I feel unloved because I can't tell people Bob beat me up, and I can't talk to anybody about how it felt to be beat up by Bob and how terrified I am of him. So I go to counseling. And in counseling, I learned the truth. Bob is wrong to beat me up. Bob is a good man, but he has addiction problems. He has his own trauma to deal with, and he's suffering and he's hurting people trying to deal with it. And I need to forgive him and love him and recognize that he's just a struggling addict. And I need to love him and talk to him about what he's doing or live with what he's doing. Now, I could get there from going to counseling, but now I'm sitting here with this situation. I'm an abuse victim who cannot stop the abuse, and now I'm a man. I'm no longer a victim. My childhood has come and gone. The season of manhood has arrived. I cannot respond like a child. I must respond like a man. Now, God blesses me with a child. I meet a woman, I want to start a family. What is my choice? I could stay in my village and stop trying to get people to not beat children. But likely, if I stay in that community, because the violence happened in the past and it has continued to grow and multiple children have been treated with violence as children, when they grow up, what is their go-to learning? What have they learned in their childhood? They've learned how to be violent. They've learned how to practice violence. They've learned how to adapt to violence. They've minimized violence. They normalize violence. And they've made violence a daily thing. It's what people do. So, as a healed person who has attained forgiveness for my abusers and for the people who allowed it to happen, I've attained that. I understand it. And in attaining that knowledge, that understanding, and that grace, I've also had to learn about the path to grace and to forgiveness, the path to healing and recovery from abusive behaviors. Now I'm standing in the middle of the community that abused me, in the middle of the family that abused me, and I'm looking about myself and I'm saying, what should I do? What are my options? Wisdom would tell me that it's not safe to raise kids around violent communities, that violence begets violence. My children will likely be dealing with violence if I bring them to that community. Furthermore, if I stay in the community, I am most likely going to have to deal with violence on a regular basis. As to say, if I live in a community that doesn't oppose violence against other people, I'm going to deal with violence from other people. So, deciding to treat societal issues as individual issues force people to apply individual solutions to community problems. I was a victim of this. I grew up with extensive childhood trauma. And when I became a dad and started raising my kids, I stopped and said, would my kids be safe at home? Would they be safe around my parents who traumatized me and told me I can't talk about it? Would my kids be safe around people who refused to stop the trauma that was going on with me? And this is a difficult sticking point for a lot of people. I personally chose to go to counseling and learn how to adapt to my people in my family. I have an interesting story about how this cycle of infidelity in my life, promiscuity, developed. And it was developed in a counselor's office. It was developed with a counselor hand in hand, learning how I could have a human experience of being a young man and having sexual experiences with other women my age, how to do that without having flashbacks. And flashbacks, I would say, and that's without getting into the nastiness of it. But how could I practice the human experience of developing meaningful relationships with women, which is a human drive of all human beings? Well, not all, but the greater majority of humanity wants to get married, develop a meaningful connection, have intercourse and create children, or at least have intercourse and have a good time. It's a human experience, and I couldn't do that without feeling shame and flashbacks. And I was a teenager in foster care, and I went to counseling. And through counseling, I learned how to have that normal human experience of having sexual relationships with women. And the story of that is pretty funny and sad and tragic. So, what could we replace this with? What does First Nations people have? What could we replace it with? I think we need to start preparing our clans and our people for these things. For example, we need to have methods and practices and awareness and interventions that target these very specific issues. Uh, you cannot treat a First Nations person as not a First Nations person. When I chose to raise my kids in the city and not in the village, specifically because I seen that in the villages things were not opposed. In my community, it happened to me, and I assumed it would happen to my kids if I brought my kids there. I could not get people to talk about what happened to me, and I couldn't get people to look at things different, so I raised my kids in the city. And that's problematic all over the place. For example, because I talk the way I do, because I acknowledge my own past abuse and abuse of my children, my native people have ostracized me. And that's just how it is. That's what has to be done if we want to maintain the facade of cultural perfection, cultural cohesion, or whatever. And I'm forced, and many of our traumatized people are forced to make that choice. If we speak, we are ostracized and we are pushed out. And if we don't speak, we are condoning the behavior that happened to us. And as adults, we start to recognize that we're condoning the behavior of other adults, our counterparts, doing that to little versions of ourselves. And that's something that needs to be recognized. And if we aren't going to change what we do, we aren't going to change how we interact with traumatized people, then we need to start preparing traumatized people for the inevitable outcome of wisdom and of understanding and of compassion and grace and knowledge that trying to maintain a healthy lifestyle and a healthy life in an unhealthy, toxic environment is impossible. That interventions is not about how to feel better in the prison situation and recognizing that present day interventions aren't going to heal people. It won't get a person to be healed. It'll get a person to be capable of adapting to the reality that they're living. I can go to counseling, and counseling will teach me how to be happy and at peace despite the fact that me and my children have been traumatized in our childhood and nobody has stopped it. I would have to go to counseling and learn how to be happy and at peace with the fact that my son committed suicide in this whole silence and not talking thing. And there is much more that I would have to accept about what happened to my son and say, okay, I'm at peace with that. There was nothing we could have done about it. And for me to be silent, I would say, my words mean nothing, and my words can't change things. So I'm stuck with either speaking the truth or being ostracized. And that is reality. No one around me can acknowledge what I say is true and also remain unchanged. Because if I say childhood trauma is the reason we have issues, and people say, I really care about our issues, if I could prove that childhood trauma is the core of all our issues, we have to deal with childhood trauma. And in order to deal with childhood trauma, we have to acknowledge that trauma is happening. A part of that acknowledgement is being able to hear and see what is happening. And when we say we can't look at it, we're saying we can't respond to it. I haven't really talked about possibilities yet because the possibilities that I see are not very good possibilities. This is 41 minutes, so I'm going to stop this and I'll do a second part, get my coffee filled up. I'll do a second part about what we can do because I promised that. And I don't want to just speak about problems. God bless.